Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to unpack complex topics, really give you that shortcut to being genuinely well informed. Today, we're getting into a really crucial and, let's be honest, often sensitive subject: ethnicity and crime. Specifically, we want to look at this complex question around bias in the justice system. And it feels really vital to say this right up front. This deep dive isn't about suggesting any inherent criminality in any group, not at all. Our mission here is to examine the social, the systemic reasons that might lie behind the official crime statistics. Because, well, those statistics are pretty stark. When you actually look at the numbers, Black people are significantly overrepresented across the board in the criminal justice system. You know, they're stopped and searched more, arrested more, charged, convicted, and ultimately imprisoned at much higher rates than white people. It's this consistent pattern, and it really demands an explanation. So that presents us with a puzzle, doesn't it? What are the sociological explanations for these patterns we keep seeing? Okay, let's try and unpack this.
Absolutely. Our journey today, essentially, is to sift through these different sociological lenses. Each one gives us a unique piece of this really complex picture. We're aiming to help you move beyond maybe simple assumptions towards a much deeper understanding of why these figures exist in the first place.
Okay, so to really get into this, we need our first tool, if you like, a framework called Left Realism, particularly the work of Leah and Young. Now, this perspective, it challenges some common ideas, doesn't it?
It does.
What they suggest, and this can be, well, challenging for some, is that alongside that undeniable systemic bias we mentioned, the statistics might also reflect a real, though probably quite modest, difference in actual offending rates between some groups.
Right. But crucially, they argue this isn't about inherent criminality. That's a really important distinction. Instead, it's presented as a kind of ripple effect from profound social disadvantage.
A critical distinction, like you say, and one that often gets missed in, public debates.
Precisely. And what's really insightful in their work is how they connect that potential small difference to concepts like relative deprivation and marginalization.
Okay, can you break this down a bit? Relative deprivation.
Yeah, so imagine feeling intensely unfair, that sense of being really left behind compared to others around you, even if you're not like in absolute grinding poverty. It's about who you compare yourself to.
Right, feeling deprived relative to the mainstream or what you see others having.
Exactly. That feeling, that relative deprivation, especially when combined with a sense of being marginalized, sort of pushed to the edges, lacking power or representation in society, well, that combination can foster subcultures, almost as a response, a way to cope or gain status.
And some of those subcultures born out of this disadvantage might then potentially lead to higher rates of certain types of crime, like street crime, perhaps.
That's the argument they make. It's a structural explanation rooted in inequality, not individual pathology.
So left realism gives us one powerful lens, focusing on, the real impact of deprivation and marginalization. But now let's shift gears a bit. Let's turn to a dramatically different perspective, one that asks a really provocative question. What if the problem isn't just about offending behavior out there, but is actually created, or at least amplified, by how society and the justice system perceive and react?
Ah, yes. This brings us squarely into labeling theory.
Exactly. And specifically, Stuart Hall's classic study on the moral panic over mugging back in the 1970s. It's such a striking example of this theory in action. What was Hall's core argument there? Remind us.
Well, Hall argued that the government at the time was facing deep economic problems, social instability, what he called a crisis of capitalism. And in that context, they needed a scapegoat, a powerful distraction. Yes. He argued that a moral panic about mugging, a term often associated with street robbery, was deliberately sort of engineered or at least amplified. The media, politicians, they painted this vivid, really fear-inducing picture of young Black men specifically as this major new threat to society.
Creating a folk devil, essentially.
Precisely. And this widespread fear then justified or appeared to justify increased policing, more aggressive tactics, specifically targeting those young Black men, which of course led to more arrests of Black youths for these kinds of offenses.
Which then seemed to prove the original stereotype, right? Cementing this idea of the Black mugger.
Exactly. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The label, the policing focus, generates the statistics that seem to confirm the label.
That's such a powerful argument, the idea that the system itself can, in a way, create the crime figures we see. But thinking about listeners trying to grasp this, how do we differentiate? I mean, between an actual criminal act someone commits and this sort of criminal identity that the system might impose. Is it ever truly one or the other? Or is it always tangled up?
That's a great question. And realistically, it's almost always intertwined. Labeling theory isn't generally saying that no crime happened initially. Rather, it emphasizes how the reaction to certain acts or certain groups, the label that gets applied, can escalate and amplify the whole issue.
So the label itself changes things.
Yes. If you're constantly stopped, searched, viewed with suspicion, labeled as trouble or criminal, well, legitimate opportunities might start to close off. You might be excluded from jobs, from education. And sometimes that can lead to further deviance, maybe even embracing that criminal identity as a way to survive or push back.
So it shows that official statistics aren't just this like neutral count of bad things happening.
Exactly. They're also a measure of who gets focused on, who gets labeled, and how the system itself operates. They reflect decisions made by police, prosecutors, courts.
Okay, so we have deprivation from left realism, societal reaction from labeling theory. But beyond those individual interactions or societal panics, we also need to confront maybe an even deeper, more embedded issue: institutional racism.
Right.
The idea that the justice system itself, in its very structures, its procedures, its culture, can perpetuate bias, sometimes without anyone explicitly intending to be racist.
Absolutely. And the Macpherson Report, which came out of the inquiry into the tragic murder of Stephen Lawrence in 1998, was a real landmark moment here in the UK. Its conclusion that the Metropolitan Police was institutionally racist sent shockwaves.
It did. But what does that actually mean in practical terms? How does institutional racism contribute to these skewed statistics we started with?
Well, what it means is that the routine policies, the practices, the procedures, even the sort of collective, maybe unconscious attitudes and assumptions within an organization can systematically disadvantage people from ethnic minority groups. It's not necessarily about finding individual officers who hold overtly racist views, though that can exist too, of course.
It's more systemic.
Yes, it's about the rules of the game, the way things are normally done, unintentionally creating unequal outcomes. Things like stop and search patterns, decisions on bail, how cases are prosecuted. And this institutional aspect, along with what sociologists sometimes call canteen culture.
Ah, yes, the informal culture within the police.
Exactly. The sort of backstage chat, the shared assumptions, the jokes, the stereotypes that can circulate informally among officers. If that culture includes racist tropes or biases, it can subtly influence discretionary decisions out on the street or in the station.
Even if it's not official policy.
Right. So that institutional bias plus that informal canteen culture are seen as key factors in explaining why ethnic minorities, particularly black people, are overrepresented in the figures. It's like this background hum of bias that can shape daily operations.
It paints a pretty concerning picture of systemic issues, but it's also important to remember, isn't it, that this isn't a single monolithic story across all ethnic minority groups.
That's a crucial point, yes.
While Black individuals are significantly overrepresented, some other groups, particularly people from Indian and Chinese backgrounds, for example, are often underrepresented in these same crime statistics compared to the white majority.
That's right. They often have lower rates of offending and victimization, according to the official data.
So how do sociologists explain that variation?
Well, this often leads sociologists to explore factors within those communities themselves. Things like perhaps stronger community bonds, different family structures, or maybe more effective informal social controls.
Like internal pressures to conform.
Potentially.
Yeah.
For example, some researchers might point to a strong emphasis on family honor, or maybe collective responsibility within certain Asian communities, which could act as a kind of protective factor, providing an alternative form of social control that discourages offending, particularly among young people.
So it highlights just how complex this whole picture is. It's definitely not a simple one-to-one link between ethnicity and crime. Many factors are at play.
Absolutely. Social class, age, gender, community context, they all interact with ethnicity in really complex ways.
Okay. So drawing this together, what does all this mean for you listening to this, for how you might view crime statistics, or maybe even how you interpret news headlines about crime? What we've really seen today is how these deep social structures and also the actions and reactions of the state, particularly the justice system, can have this massive impact on who actually ends up being defined and processed as a criminal and who doesn't. We touched on left realism, Leah and Young suggesting that real social deprivation, that relative deprivation and marginalization, can explain some perhaps small, real differences in offending for certain crimes.
Then we had labeling theory, really powerfully illustrated by Stuart Hall's work on moral panics,
Mm.
showing us how the system's reaction, the labeling process itself, can actually shape criminal identities and,
Mm.
paradoxically, almost create the crime problem it claims to be solving.
And finally, we confronted that tough issue of institutional racism, highlighted by the Macpherson Report, and the influence of things like canteen culture within policing, showing how systemic bias can permeate the whole justice process.
So perhaps a final thought to leave you with. If these official statistics that we started with are, at least in part, a reflection of how the justice system operates, who it targets, how it labels the biases within it, and not just a pure reflection of individual actions, then it raises a really important question for you to consider, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How much of what we perceive as crime through those statistics is purely about individual wrongdoing, and how much might actually be a product of the systemic lenses, the biases, the social structures through which we as a society view and police ourselves?
A really complex interplay. Definitely something worth continuing to think about and to approach with a critically informed eye. Thank you for joining us on the deep dive.